Welcome, everybody, to this Charleston Conference session on Unravelling the Ethical Enigma. I'm just moderating today. These three wonderful people are your actual experts, and I'm going to ask them all to introduce themselves, starting with Sam in the middle there.
Oh, it's interesting to start in the middle.
This is what it says on
It
here.
is, you're not wrong. I'm Sam Green. I am the head of content marketing at Morressier. We are a technology platform for research integrity.
And Mike.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Streeter, Director of Research Integrity Strategy and Policy at Wiley. We are a publisher of peer-reviewed academic research, and my role is in my title, so research integrity.
So last but definitely not least, Lisa.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Janicki Hinchliffe. I am a professor and the coordinator for research and teaching professional development at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, but probably here more in my role as someone who is an industry watcher and writes for the Scholarly Kitchen, looking at a number of these different issues. So looking forward to our conversation today.
So clearly, you represent quite different parts of our knowledge community. What I'd love to know is what you see as the current responsibility of your bit of the stakeholder community for upholding research ethics and research integrity. We'll start with Mike, please.
So as a publisher, I kind of think about this in three ways. One is that we have a responsibility for what we publish, so after we publish it. So essentially, that's about maintaining the integrity of the scholarly record, whether that means issuing a correction or issuing a retraction or some other post-publication form. It also includes our responsibility for what we publish. So that means essentially ensuring that what we put to peer review is in its best possible shape, that it's in compliance with our editorial and integrity policies. And then in a third, it's kind of a cheat, but I would say it's transparency, and that is around what our policies are with respect to research integrity and our editorial policies, and ensuring those are visible to the different stakeholders who are involved in the publishing process. And I will just tack on to that when I'm talking about transparency, thinking about our advocacy and the infrastructure that we put in place for open research practices, which is one of the main pillars of research integrity.
Sam?
So I think coming from the sort of technology vendor perspective here, you often think of integrity and peer review together, but I think that technology absolutely cannot and probably should not replace the expertise of sort of a human-led peer review. However, I think technology has a huge role to play in making it easier, making the process easier, making the whole experience easier for author, for editor, for publisher. And technology in general and infrastructure kind of more broadly should really be there to connect the dots between different stakeholders, between different parts of the process, between different types of research objects, so that information can be discovered more easily, verified more easily, and validated more easily.
So I get to do this at three levels. One, as somebody who is a researcher, professor, et cetera, within the higher education setting, I'd like to also talk about our institution's responsibility. So we have individuals and institutions, and then within that, a little bit of thought about what might the role of the library be, and perhaps what could it be if we wanted to move forward in that direction, because I'm not sure that libraries have engaged in this space as much as possible as they could. So I'm going to start with the individual researcher. Obviously, the integrity of one's own work is one's responsibility. And particularly in the context of higher education, in that kind of research setting, it's interesting because that is really situated on the individual researcher. And so while there are institutional workflows and the like in place, there is no supervisory actually role over the researcher in the higher education context. So this is going to, of course, be somewhat different than if we were to go into a research setting in some healthcare settings, or where in pharma or some other places where research might be done, where there's still a little bit more of a hierarchical, somebody is supervising. No one supervises the faculty in higher education. I think we all know that. But that creates a particularly entrepreneurial culture for sure, but it also creates a particular risk because you are then saying, well, I just hope every single one of these people understands and lives up to their expectations. We know they do not all, even at the most basic level of things like, there are human beings in your study. Did you do IRB? There is maybe some sensitive information or technologies on your laptop and you're leaving the country with it. Export controls are another part of that research integrity. So there's a lot on the individual researcher, not the least of which is, of course, the accuracy of their work in their lab, their supervision of their graduate students and postdocs. So I don't think we can understate the degree to which higher education primarily devolves the responsibility for research integrity to the individual. This is therefore also one of the biggest problems that we have, because at the same time, institutions have an obligation, typically through regulatory functions or financial functions, to ensure that these people they are not supervising actually do what they are supposed to do. And so part of this becomes the kind of regulatory oversight that institutions have had to increasingly comply with, which of course often chafes against that researcher independence, et cetera, where they're being asked not only now to get IRB if they need it, but perhaps to fill out a form to explain why they didn't need it, right? So now, like, almost every research has to go through this. Animal welfare, same sorts of things. We certainly see that when people are getting grants and that they understand all of these sorts of things that they have to comply with. In addition, publishers are often having to try and find the research integrity officer, of which our campuses typically do have in the Office of Research, when there are breaches of research integrity or suspected breaches of research integrity, where a publisher needs to say, hey, does this person exist? Like, lots of research integrity actually has to do with false claimed affiliations. So does this person even exist at your institution? Do they work in this area? Hey, this article, we have some reason to think data was fabricated. Could you investigate this? Those offices are typically very small, and they are at least as much charged with protecting the reputation of the institution as they are with ensuring that research integrity happens. And so there's a little bit of a conflict in their sort of dual roles that they have. So there's this office in the research integrity area as well. And I mean, there's lots of other people that have obligations, but I know in higher ed we're often a little frustrated with the increased regulation. Much of that is coming as an attempt to sort of regulate those. So with respect to libraries, in that higher ed situation, I want to kind of bring up two things. One is what I'll call our whole area of from information literacy to research training. So we are often involved in the education of future researchers with respect to research integrity practices. Citing your sources is important. Any number of things that might be coming into our information literacy and researcher training programs. We might even be teaching them how to use particular technology tools where we would need to attend to issues of like, here's mistakes you can make with this software. Don't make those mistakes because they will cause major problems for you. Libraries also historically have protected the scholarly record through our dollars. So historically, thinking back to when I became a librarian, when we're buying for reading, we only bought the stuff that we thought was good enough to spend money on. And so in many cases, you couldn't publish like a whole crappy journal because you couldn't get any library to subscribe to it. So we had a kind of role with respect to research integrity that came from our market power of saying, we're not buying that. Right? So no one's going to keep publishing something libraries aren't going to buy in a pay-to-read world. We're not in a pay-to-read world so much anymore, and I think that's one of the things libraries will have to decide is, as we are paying for publishing, are we going to step up in a different way in that role to saying that we are going to help ensure that whoever we have paid to, that the research we are paying for it to be published, what is that? Because in the long run, if we also think about retractions, any APC or transformative agreement, PAR, sub-fee, like however it's structured, any money we spend that publishes an article that is later retracted because of a research integrity problem potentially is not good stewardship of our institution's resources. That's a really complicated thing to say, what are we going to do about that? But I just want to paint this picture that historically we were engaged in research integrity protections in one very, very real way, and that has stepped aside. Okay, so that I got to answer more on this particular question than they did because we wanted to sort of think beyond the publishers in ways that we haven't always done so. And so thank you for a little bit of grace in that.
I'm hoping that you will give me similar grace because I am actually now going to change the order of your questions. Lisa, you talked about retractions and the need to really curate a safe collection of content. And I'd love to understand from all of you what you think we can be doing in our different stakeholder groups to really help the end user, the researcher, the student, the layperson, understand what has happened with retracted materials. I'm going to start with Mike.
When you say what has happened with retracted materials, essentially why something has been retracted and making that visible, is that about right?
Yeah. For sure. Why it's gone, and what you should do or not do with that material. Yeah,
okay. No, that's an important question because I think increasingly, and I think some of you in this audience will have recognized this, we're seeing, not only at Wiley, but I think the industry is seeing an increased level of research integrity concerns that are being raised. Maybe that's because of the volume of the output. It might be because of the levels of screening that we're doing. And I think that the term paper mills is probably not unfamiliar to many of you in this audience either. This is a very huge and large challenge for our industry, but also for the research community and the trust that's in place for those of us sort of doing research and citing that research. So I think, as a publisher, if we think about if we need to do something that results in a retraction, if an investigation results in a retraction, I talked about transparency in my first response about the responsibilities that we have. And one of the things that is most important, I think, is ensuring it's not just retracting that article, it's ensuring that those readers who are potentially coming across that piece of research know that that article is retracted. So for instance, when we retract an article in our portfolio, we include retracted in the title of that article. The PDF carries a retracted watermark, and we end up, we also include the retraction notice and replace the HTML version of the article with that retraction notice. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really about, in terms of visibility, ensuring that there's really clear signposting around the retractions that we do. And it's also, and I don't want to make this only about retractions. I think that signposting is important for any kind of post-publication action that we take. So a correction, why did we issue a correction and what led to that correction? And ensuring that whoever's reading that paper can very easily access that correction. Mm-hmm. We also make the retractions that we publish, and I suspect most publishers are doing this as well, but the retractions that we publish are made free. They're made freely available so that they're easily accessible to anyone who's reading that research, and it's linked to the version of record. So kind of linking back to that responsibility component to this, that notion of visibility is really important for us when we do any kind of post-publication action for anything that we have published.
Lisa, could you follow up on what librarians can do to help boost that visibility of post-publication
Yeah,
information.
it's interesting. I'm thinking back to being a student worker in the print age where I actually was responsible for tipping in some of those retracted notions into the bound volumes. And so a lot of times I'm thinking like, okay, that's how we did it before, so what's our equivalent responsibility here? So one of the things as I'm actually listening to Mike talk, I'm like, well, that's great for people who are going to the version of record. But if we think about how especially open access content travels off publisher platform, even the version of record, say into our library's institutional repositories. Are we doing any sort of work if we are sort of auto-downloading, which I know some libraries do, or we're just having researchers reposit it, whether it's the author-accepted manuscript or the version of record, just depending. Are we doing anything to ensure that our institutional repository copies reflect that change in status? Or do we have a case where the publisher's version of record is carrying a correction or a retraction, but the library is continuing to serve up the original with no warning to a user whatsoever? And so that would be, I think, a case where we are sort of serving as a quasi-publisher in an institutional repository, that we might need to think about the responsibility then as a publisher, quote unquote, to ensure that kind of data gets into our institutional repository, and perhaps having policies around, are we going to, all the things Mike just talked about, are we going to just label it? Are we going to remove it? All of those sorts of things that we might need to think about with respect to that. But I mean, I agree with Mike, and I know we'll get to this. Retraction is something that happens when the rest of the process failed, right? To prevent it from getting in there in the first place. So I'd really like us to make sure that of course we need to do diligence when something shouldn't have been published, but it'd be better if we didn't publish it in the first place then. And so we might need to think about what that looks like as well. But Sam, you were sharing an interesting study with us the other day.
Yeah, there was a study published in, I have half of the citation here, I'm sorry, Lisa. In quantitative, I'm sorry, published in Quantitative Science Studies in 2021 about the continued use of retracted papers. And there are it's actually a really interesting study. There's a lot of very interesting findings in it. But one of the ones that really struck me is that only a little over 5%, 5.4% of papers that cited retracted content made mention of the fact that content was cited, or was retracted rather. So that's a huge amount, and also there's not a huge drop-off in citations after something is retracted. So historically, and I think there's a lot that publishers are doing and a lot that the industry is doing on a standards front, and NISO has work right now about this as well, that it's being done to improve the best practice and guidelines around this. But I think there's also a role for technology in general to play to help flag that automatically. It's not feasible to kind of go into the Retraction Watch database manually and confirm every citation in every paper that nothing has been retracted since it was published. So I think there are ways to kind of automate a review of that database and make that part of the publication process. So as you say, we're not kind of continuing to cite and use things that have been retracted. Although I will also say, I think there are use cases where citing retracted content, if it is engaging with that content as a retracted piece of research, can still be valuable. And retractions are not this inherent evil or breakdown. They are a valuable part of the self-correcting nature of the scholarly record. But that context can get really lost in translation as we move through the process.
So if I can drill into this a little bit, you've mentioned the need for self-correcting the scholarly record. Who or which actors do you see as being accountable for managing that correction process and ensuring that we have a solid scholarly corpus? I'm going straight back to Sam. Sorry.
I mean, I might throw it back to Mike. I think that, I think one of the, I think it's a shared responsibility, right? I do. I think that there's a lot of different roles that can be played, whether it's within institutions, at publishers, or through, vendor support with kind of flagging issues or kind of drawing attention to misconduct or error or anything like that. But ultimately, I think, and I think that Mike would agree with me on this, that the publisher is responsible for the quality of the work that they publish.
Sure. Back to you.
No, it's a really good point. And I think that question of accountability is, that's one thing that you have a responsibility. It's another thing to be kind of held to actually undertake that responsibility. I agree with Sam that I think that all of the stakeholders that are involved are accountable, but not to sort of diffuse the sort of accountability. We all have individual sort of accountabilities and roles to play within that. And I think over the course of the last, certainly the last 3 to 4 years, one way that we're learning about research integrity concerns is through external, what are commonly referred to as research integrity sleuths. So people like Elizabeth Bick, who gave the keynote at the Society for Scholarly Publishing annual meeting this year. People like Dorothy Bishop, who is a psychologist based in the UK. Jennifer Byrne, who's a molecular oncologist, who are doing a lot of this work externally to raise these concerns directly to publishers. And as a publisher, sometimes this is not a particularly comfortable thing to be engaging in. But I think to Sam's point, we certainly do have a responsibility for the quality of what we publish. But again, kind of coming down to the fact that we're also responsible for the record, but then we are accountable for sort of taking the action that's required when those concerns get raised. And research integrity sleuths are not the only ones that raise those. They come from, they certainly come from authors themselves who are self-reporting errors. So, the notion being that that retraction is not a punishment; it is a post-publication corrective action that we're taking. We also see concerns raised by readers or others who might notice some kind of error in the record that needs to be corrected. So all of that comes to us, also through social media. And then we have the accountability to sort of take that forward, right, and do the investigation.
Lisa, I know this was not on our question list, but I would like to ask you about the sort of the upstream aspect of this. How do we, as a community, encourage researchers to see research integrity as a core part of what they do and to self-correct when they spot a problem?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful, and I feel like, really thinking about the different sort of, if you will, categories of research integrity is a part of an issue here. So there's the research integrity, which is like, it turns out I made a mistake. What do I do when I've made a mistake? Mm-hmm. There's the, I intentionally committed fraud in the system. It's not going to be a self-correcting typically then, right? But there's also other kinds of research integrity issues that aren't so much around publication per se. There's research integrity issues with how do you treat people who work in your lab, that kind of context. So I think what we are seeing is that institutions are recognizing that this is a growing area of concern for a number of different reasons. Some of having to do with the problems around fraud, so our paper murals, peer review rings, fake data, and we've had some very high profile individuals kind of brought down and potentially lose their positions and the like. Yet at the same time, to the moment, this is interesting because the questions we had brainstormed were about like, whose responsibility is it and who's accountable for it? And I kind of feel like not everyone who's actually responsible is actually accountable at the moment, including, I'll just say I'm actually quite puzzled at the degree to which institutions appear to be reputationally unscathed by having somebody who has committed actual fraud. So not error, but fraud. Mm-hmm. And so there's a little bit of a tension there, right? Because in some ways an institution doesn't probably want to take more control because then they'll be more accountable. at the same time, I think I feel like there might also be the, like, no one wants to be the first institution after the tipping point, where suddenly the institution is in the spotlight in a new way. I mean, I know there's a prominent researcher who was at my own institution, went somewhere else, recruited, and was found to have committed fraud for quite some time, including when he was at my institution. And I know a lot of people were like, whew, that other institution's problem now. So I think there's still this challenge of people may have responsibilities, but may not be accountable for carrying out those responsibilities. And the other thing I just want to kind of mention is the growing need to act in this area is there is no revenue for it, right? Mm-hmm. So like a publisher doesn't get more money when they're dealing with an integrity problem. So like Mike's whole office is just a drain. No, you know. But like, so like to the degree, right? So this has to come from some other place besides a monetary thing, because the more research integrity issues you have to deal with, the more you are diverting resources away from, and this goes at the institution as well, right? So the more people we need in our research integrity office, the more people we need in our compliance roles, the more proactive, like all of that is money in the shape of people's time. Mm-hmm. So I think we're seeing an increased need, but I don't think anyone's quite figured out what that looks like yet. And Mike wants to defend himself.
I
not looking to defend myself at all. There's a really valid point. So there's just one point I wanted to make too, just in response to Lisa's point that my office is a drain. And that is, I think, I don't want to steal too much thunder from the next session that's scheduled to talk about a similar issue, but I think as publishers and others in this community, we need to take more of a preventative posture to identifying this stuff before it publishes, right? Because once it does publish, the resource that's required to go in and do an investigation and to do it fairly and do it in alignment with our own policies, in alignment with the Committee on Publication Ethics best practices, which is completely appropriate, is also very labor and cost intensive, right? Sure. So I'm not looking to bring a revenue component into this, but I think naturally, though, we as publishers, do want to take this preventative and create this preventative posture in the way that we go about our work, right?
So, Sam, I suspect you have a comment on the role of tech in this.
I do. I also think that it's hard in general, because I think that the scale of the scholarly record overall is rapidly growing year over year, so it becomes harder and harder and harder to do this work. And I think peer review processes are under strain. I think it's harder and harder to find new peer reviewers for more and more articles, and this problem is only getting bigger and bigger every year. So addressing research integrity in that pre-publication stage is challenging, and it does need some real intense interventions, I think, in order to do it on a efficient level, but still maintaining that quality. And I do think that that's a place where tech can play a role. I started this by saying that technology can't replace humans in the peer review process, but I think that there are a lot of points at which they can take away some manual checks that need to happen, or pieces of the process that can be automated in order to have, machines doing what machines do best and humans doing what humans do best. And having that partnership and that collaboration in peer review, I think, can have a real big impact, so that we are able to be more proactive and less kind of reactive, which is a lot of what is kind of happening in the post-publication phases. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
Sure. I'm going to open this to the floor. Has anyone got a question for our wonderful panel?